Hi guys, welcome to this presentation about rebreather diving. Why are we here? About a week ago, I had an opportunity to present at the first ever Taucherlebnistage, diving experience days organized by friends of mine in Germany. And one of the presentations I gave featured exactly this topic. How do you start rebreather diving? How does it work? Where do you find out about rebreathers? How do you even get started? Now, the presentation had plenty of people attending and had lots of questions being asked, so I thought I put it up on my YouTube channel. Problem was, we didn't plan on recording it and the audio was really rather rough. So the point of today is that I talk you through exactly the same presentation again, and if my AI tools work, then you will start seeing German language subtitles. So you get me talking in English, keep the audio on, or if you want to see the whole thing in German, the slides will all be bilingual, but you should see some German language subtitles. All right, so what are we going to cover? I will talk about rebreather diving, reasons for, potential reasons against, how to choose a rebreather to buy or to learn on, and where you even start. If you haven't met me, if you don't know much about me, my name is Yvonne. I'm a TDI instructor trainer and KISS Sidewinder Mod 2 instructor. Yes, that's a mouthful. Based in Gozo, one of the Maltese islands. I've been diving rebreathers for about 10 years now, and I've been teaching on them for about 7 years. This presentation is not only going to talk about the KISS Sidewinder, although that is my favorite tool at the moment. It will tell you quite generically about rebreather diving, and I will cite other examples as we go as well. All right, so let's get started. Why should you be interested in rebreather diving? Now, one of the things that always strikes me whenever I go from open circuit diving to rebreather is the silence. Now, when I say silence, I mean silence in the sense of Darth Vader, for those of you who've seen Star Wars. You can hear yourself breathe. So it's not complete silence, but it is very, very, very quiet compared to a normal dive. At the same time, you also notice a difference when you go back to open circuit diving or when you dive with open circuit buddies. You can hear them before you can see them. Is also almost bubble free. Why do I say almost? Because you have to imagine the counterlung of a rebreather a little bit like your BCD. When you start ascending towards the end of your dive, the gas in it expands. That means you have to blow some bubbles to manage that extra positive buoyancy. So rebreather diving is largely bubble free, but not for the entire time of the dive. On ascent, it's completely normal that you will need to blow some bubbles. What next? Marine life comes closer. One of my first really noticeable, memorable rebreather diving events was when I simply looked to my right and there was a fish. Here, I kid you not, here. I hadn't seen it coming, I had no idea it was there. I turned and I was like, whoa, okay. So that's something that happens when you're not making bubbles and when you're very quiet underwater. Marine life comes closer. It's one of the reasons why photographers like diving rebreathers, for example. Longer no decompression limits. Why is that? Think of a rebreather as a gas mixing machine on your back. You are breathing the optimal, let's say nitrox or trimix gas all throughout your dive. That means you minimize decompression times if that's the kind of dive you're doing, or you maximize no decompression limits. You'll also use a lot less gas. So I'm going to use the Sidewinder as an example because it's easier to imagine, I think. Now, it would be diving in a Sidemount configuration, double 11-liter, 80 cubic feet cylinders, and all you're likely to use is something like 5 to 10 bar of gas for your dry suit or your wing, and another 5 to 10 bar as diluent, as the gas that you are consistently rebreathing. So you see, I use a lot less gas. I can easily get through a weekend of diving on one set of cylinders, obviously depending on the kind of dive I want to do. There's more flexible dive planning. Why? Because you haven't got such a finite gas reserve that you need to track. What you have really are the limits of your scrubber. That's the material that reacts with the carbon dioxide you're exhaling. There's some limitations with the amount of oxygen that you've taken with you. And there's obviously also a limit depending on how long your bailout gas, your emergency gas, would last you. But within those parameters, you're very, very, very flexible, meaning that you're not constantly looking at your SPG to find out just how much more time you can allow yourself on this dive. Combined with the optimized no decompression limits, you'll also find that you just get more time at a given depth in most cases. The result of that will be longer dives. Rebreather diving simply changes the way you think about diving and the way you dive. So the question of how many dives have you done today changes to how long have you been diving today? And you'll find that it changes how you think about the dives that you can do. Plus, if you are diving trimix, you will find that your helium bill becomes a lot smaller. An example, which is a little bit of a specific time because it goes back to COVID. During COVID, if you've known me for a while, you know that I used to operate dark horizon diving in Bali. So during COVID, we all got stuck. Eventually, it was okay to go diving again. Dive sites were open again, but there were still no tourists. So we had time. It's about all we had, but we had time. And a buddy and I started doing some dives on dive sites where you would normally not do decompression dives. Why? Because the conditions are too unpredictable. However, when you have time, you can start really correlating tides, moon phases, currents, anything else you're seeing, and really you can start pinpointing the perfect time to go and do these dives. We ended up doing probably about 3-4 dives a week, 60 meters on dive sites where we wouldn't normally go diving, and had amazing mola encounters. The other thing we realized, at some point we sat down to do the math to figure out just how much these dives would have cost had we dived using trimix on open circuit. And we found that we had each saved several thousand euros. So the helium bill is significantly lower, and the rebreather can, over time, make you back the money you've spent. But don't think of it as a quick way to save for your diving, because that is truly not what it is. Which brings me to potential reasons why you might not want to choose rebreather diving. There is the cost of entry. There's the cost of training. There's also the cost of investing in a unit for you. Now, can you do your rebreather course on a rental unit? The answer will differ from instructor to instructor. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. There are reasons for and against. Most rebreather divers will tell you that they prefer to have their own unit and know how it works and know exactly how it's been set up, how it has been looked after. But you will also find locations where you can rent a unit. But there is the cost of entry, and that's significant. There's a degree of complexity too. Now, rebreather diving is not as such complicated, but it does require more preparation and a little bit more aftercare than you would have on a standard open circuit dive. That's why we use checklists. That's why we tend to arrive at the dive center a little bit earlier, or just simply plan our day differently. If that's not what you want to do, if all you want to do is arrive at the dive center, arrive at the boat, put your gear together in 10 minutes or less, double check everything and jump in the water, then rebreather diving is not for you, and that's okay. But if you're willing to invest your time in that complexity and follow these procedures, you'll be rewarded with a different kind of diving. That then requires a certain commitment. What do I mean by that? One of the things you cannot safely do with rebreather diving is treat it like a lot of people treat a skiing holiday. And by that I mean once a year for a week, and for the remaining 50 plus weeks, you don't think about skiing at all. Your skis at best are sitting somewhere in the basement or in the attic. If you want to safely rebreather dive, this has to become your diving. And that means that rebreather needs to come on dives that don't really require a rebreather. If you're going to the lake, to the quarry, to a simple training site with your friends that are not technical divers and you're diving to 20 meters for an hour, do you need to take the rebreather? No, you don't. But should you? Yes, to keep your skills fresh. Does it have to be like that every single time? Well, maybe not every single time, but depending on how often you get in the water, it's a good idea to make the rebreather the tool that you use for your diving so that you stay fresh. And then there's the argument of having to learn to dive again. Now, most of us are used to using our lungs to control our buoyancy, at least to a degree. One of the things I quite often say to people who start technical diving is that they do need to use their wings for buoyancy because the lungs are simply not big enough. Now, when you start rebreather diving, what happens is that you lose the ability to stop your descent just by inhaling big, and you can also not truly stop your ascent just by exhaling. If you're inhaling, you're simply taking your breath out of your counter lung into your own lungs. If you're exhaling, you send that breath back into those counter lungs. Depending on where those counter lungs are, what you might experience is a trim change. So you might find that your head or your torso go up if your counter lungs are towards the top of your body. Or you might find that if your counter lungs are on the side of your body, that side goes up slightly or not. But you do not really have that capacity to use your lungs. In the beginning, it's one of the trickiest things to learn. That is true. How much that messes with you, that really varies from individual to individual. On the Sidewinder, the step is usually quite smooth and quite fast, simply because it's a fairly small rebreather with not a lot of dead air spaces. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. So, reasons for, reasons against, and those are questions that you need to answer for yourself. Now let's talk about how a rebreather works. If you understand this already, feel free to skip to the next chapter. You should have an option to do that at the bottom of the video there. So, very, very basically, how does a rebreather work? And yes, courtesy of Tony Land, this is a graphic that depicts a KISS rebreather. But let's have a look. Rebreathers clean, recycle, and monitor the diver's gas. Let's go back. Think of it as a blending machine that you have with you underwater. Electronic rebreathers also control the amount of oxygen in your breathing gas, at least in part. That depends on how you have set them up. But what happens on this specific rebreather? At the top there, you see a mouthpiece. Now, that mouthpiece is obviously what's in your mouth when you're diving, and when you're exhaling, that gas goes over to the right. You see on the right now, there you have at the top of that canister what's called a mixing chamber. You see all the hoses go there. Now, in that mixing chamber, there's actually nothing. It's simply where any gas that you're adding ends up initially. The gas then travels down through what we call the exhale scrubber in this particular configuration. From there, travels into the counter lung. That's that big U-shaped thing at the bottom. Travels across that counter lung and then starts going up on the other side. Now, if you look closely on the other side, in that chamber, you see 2 oxygen sensors. That's 2 of 3. Most rebreathers have between 2 and 5 sensors, depending on the manufacturer. 3 seems to be the most common number. You also see that there's a computer going away from that chamber. So what happens there is that the gas you're about to breathe is being analyzed, and the computer tells you what you're breathing just before you are about to breathe it. So that's really, really the basic setting. Now, what I'm saying there at the bottom, electronic rebreathers control the amount of oxygen that you're breathing. So you see at the bottom there's a little oxygen tank. Now, remember, this is a graphic of a KISS rebreather, which is mechanical, not electronic. In a mechanical rebreather, you have 2 things. You have a little orifice, think of it as a leaky valve, that constantly lets a little bit of oxygen into that loop to replace the oxygen that your body needs to function, that it burns, for lack of a better word. Plus, you have a manual addition button. So, on an electronic rebreather, you have a valve called a solenoid that makes sure that the oxygen level is maintained at a particular partial pressure. That is usually called a low set point. That's what you select at the beginning of the dive or when you're on the surface. And the high set point, that is what optimizes your no decompression limit or potentially your deco obligation. And this is a really, really abbreviated explanation. So there are more things that play into this. But basically, on an electronic rebreather, a valve opens to maintain a certain level of oxygen. On a mechanical rebreather, you get to choose that level of oxygen, but you also have the responsibility to maintain it. There are benefits and downsides to both systems. So if you would like to hear more about that, drop me a comment and that can be the next video. So, basic functioning of a rebreather: cleaning, recycling, monitoring the gas that you are breathing. You're literally re-breathing one breath, more or less throughout the dive. Which CCR should you choose? And which is the perfect one? Now, when I gave this presentation for real, a few people stopped by the stand I was on before the presentation and said, yeah, you're going to tell us all to buy a KISS Sidewinder. Well, if you think that that's the right rebreather for you, yes, go buy it. I love it. I've dived it for a few years. It was not my first rebreather. My first rebreather was the one that you saw a few slides ago here, the AP Diving Evolution. That's the yellow box. But my diving changed over a few years. And I moved more and more towards Sidemount diving. I moved more and more towards cave diving. And that's where the Sidewinder simply proved to be the better tool. But how do you make this choice? You start by answering a few questions for yourself. One of those questions could be whether you want to dive deep wrecks or small caves. Deep wrecks are often somewhere in the middle of the sea. That means boats to get out there. That means waves. That means having to stand on a moving platform before you jump. All of those things are potentially easier with a classic backmount CCR that sits sort of like a twin set or doubles on your back. Small caves. Well, how small? You could spend your entire life cave diving and never have to go into a passage that is so small that a back-mounted rebreather will not fit. On the other hand, if you're already in the Sidemount diving community, if that's already your kind of diving, then why not choose a rebreather that supports that kind of diving rather than take a step outside it and get used to a different configuration again? Another question you could ask is, do I want to dive at home? Do I want to dive nearby where I can simply load that rebreather in the back of my car and off we go? Or do I want to travel? You can travel with any rebreather. The question is just whether you book 1 or 2 pieces of additional luggage or whether you put your rebreather in your carry-on. And the picture you have here is me a few years ago in Truck Lagoon. One of the nice things about, one of the tricky things about Truck Lagoon is that it will take you several flights to get there, no matter where you're coming from. And I promise you, I really enjoyed having the peace of mind that my rebreather was with me on all the planes I had to board to get there. Does that mean that all the other rebreathers got lost? Of course not. It's simply a case for saying, this is a rebreather that is easy to take on a plane with me, and I've traveled with it quite extensively since. What about the manual or automatic question? That's something that I just talked about when we are comparing a little bit electronic and mechanical rebreathers. Electronic rebreathers will, if you let them, take over more of the control. Mechanical rebreathers let you control, but also force you to control. Benefits and downsides. Little bit like driving an automatic car or a manual car. Now, automatic cars mean you have less thinking to do. Manual cars let you choose exactly which gear you want to be in for the hill you're trying to drive up to or drive down to, or the bend you're trying to get around. These are choices. They are not good or bad. They are simply options that you can make up your mind and figure out which one would be better for you. So, what else? Is there a rebreather community near you? This is not about doing what everyone else is doing. This is about looking around to see whether there's maybe already a ready-made support network, whether there's already a ready-made support network for the stuff that you want to do. So, why would that be good? Because I promise you, after your initial rebreather course, you will have questions. If you have that support network, so if you have rebreather divers around you, that's great, because they will be able to answer some of your questions. Of course, you can also message your instructor, but sometimes it's easier to ask something face to face. And if there are people that dive the same unit that you are considering or that you've been trained on, then you'll also have a little bit of backup when it comes to having some spare parts and maybe figuring out some small issues that there might be. Not saying it has to be done, but it is something that can be great to have, especially when you're new to rebreather diving. What about weight? What about size? What about the handling underwater? So let's think about this. Perhaps you have seen the JJ rebreather in the modified configuration that's known as the GUE configuration. It's pretty much a rebreather with a twin set 7-liter tanks. It's big and it's heavy. Underwater, that's probably not so much an issue, but that configuration can come up to 60 kilos, and perhaps that's hard for you to manage on the surface. Maybe you want something smaller, maybe you want something lighter to handle. Now, it's obviously an extreme example. On the other hand, people could argue that the Sidewinder as it is there is a little bit wobbly on the surface. Well, it is until you have it on your back. But for me personally, it makes up for that in flexibility. All of those are choices and all of those are things to consider. Underwater handling, some rebreathers dive more easily, some require you to make a bigger adjustment. What are you happy with? What would you like to do? Ask yourself these questions and potentially even consider trying a few units if that's a possibility where you are. What's the moral of that story? The moral of that story is that there is no perfect rebreather. There is a rebreather out there that will do probably about 80% of the things you want to do really, really well. It will do the other 20% also. Not perfectly, but it will do them. So now, if we go back to the comparison there between the two rebreathers that I'm qualified to teach on, the AP and the Sidewinder, for my diving right now, where I like to go using side mount hangs, where I like to go into caves, the Sidewinder is the better tool. For traveling to truck, I preferred traveling with the Sidewinder because it allowed me to have the unit with me on the plane. But a few years prior to that trip, I had traveled to truck with the AP. And I can dive those wrecks just the same, but I will need to think about squeezing through openings in a different way. So ask yourself what kind of diving you want to do, look at the rebreathers available, and make a decision from there. Here's a little bit of an overview about the 4 types of classes of rebreather. And I've broken it down into sidemount, backmount, chestmount, and hybrid. So sidemount CCRs benefit pretty compact on land. They replace one sidemount cylinder, which is one of the things why I'm not a huge fan, but again, this is personal. I like the idea of my side mount configuration staying intact. I like the redundancy of the 2 cylinders. So replacing one of them with a rebreather is not my first choice. Is it a bad choice? No, absolutely not. It's a perfectly valid choice. I just made a different one. So, quite compact, replace one side mount tank, can change your trim a little bit when you're breathing. Some people need some time to get used to the angle of the loop. What do I mean by that? Now, imagine you have a rebreather sitting on your side. The loop that you're breathing from will have to come sideways. Depending on the mouthpiece and how that's configured and how that's designed, that might feel like it's pulling a little bit. Like with most cases of diving equipment, you'll need a couple of dives to adjust it, and it will be perfectly fine. But it's a thing to consider. Backmount CCR, that's your classic style of CCR. Rebreather on your back, and then you can see in the picture on one side you have a diluent gas that pretty much dilutes the oxygen. Diluent can be air, can be a trimix, can even be a nitrox on occasion. So diluent on one side, oxygen on the other side. Potentially easier for boat diving and in big waves because you have one compact thing that you put on and off you go with a couple of bailout tanks, one or a couple, depending on what you're doing. Traveling can be tricky, and diving in shallow water. Why diving in shallow water? Because of the size of it. So there's a lot more dead airspace that if you're in 3-4 meters, can expand even with the slightest of depth changes. At depth, you won't notice, but if you're in shallower water, you might notice that every single small adjustment will have a bigger impact. If you're choosing a rebreather with a smaller dead airspace, that impact will just not be so great. And that's the case, for example, with chest-mount CCRs. So they resemble these classic military oxygen rebreathers that you might have seen in movies. And they're really having a moment right now. They're super popular. What's good about them? Small, compact, and also usable with pretty much any configuration. You can use a single tank, you can use them with a twin set, you can use them with side mount. Plus, they're small and compact for traveling. Not everybody likes having something in front of them as they're diving, but again, it is a new piece of equipment you're using, so you have to give yourself some grace for actually getting used to the whole thing. My fourth category here is a hybrid CCR, and I've put the Sidewinder in there. Why did I not call it a side mount CCR? Well, think about it. The counterlung is on your back. The carbon dioxide scrubbers, the canisters that hold the softener line material that reacts with carbon dioxide are on your sides. So what is that now? Is that back mount because the counterlung is on your back? Is that side mount because the scrubbers are on your side? Does it change depending on the configuration that you dive it in? So there we go. Positives, it's a very, very natural feeling as if you're side mount diving. So if you like your side mount diving, if you're used to that, that is what that rebreather feels like. It's relatively simple. in shallow water because of the small dead airspace, and they can go to depth. Now, I have an asterisk there for depth. Why? Simply because the limits of Sidemount apply. Not many people are very comfortable diving Sidemount with more than 4 cylinders. And the design means that as the unit comes out of the box, it's limited to 93 meters, 300 feet, but modifications are possible that will allow you to take that unit deeper. Small and compact for traveling, super easy, and there is an option for a backmount configuration. So plenty of reasons that I found for me spoke for that unit. How do you start? Let's say you've done some research, you've thought about the rebreather that you want to buy, you have a good idea of where you see your diving going. Now, where do you start rebreather diving? You start with either a try dive, but let's assume you've committed to a course, and then you're looking at what's called Mod 1. If you hang around rebreather divers long enough, you'll hear those terms, Mod 1, Mod 2, Mod 3. Module 1, Module 2, Module 3, they're simply the levels of training offered by various training agencies. And there are about 3 types of Mod 1. So let's think about this as 3 starting points depending on where you're at now. So over here on the side, I have the air diluent diver. That is the right level for you if you want to have a fairly simple start and just want to get used to the unit and do some simple dives to get comfortable, build your experience before you're doing something requiring mandatory deco stops. It's also the level of training for you if you don't have any technical diving certifications or experience yet. Now, can you become a rebreather diver without some of those foundational technical diving courses? Yes, you can, although some instructors will require that you have basic technical certifications. I definitely recommend understanding nitrox with the mathematical implications. That means if you have done a very basic nitrox course, which is enough for sport diving, where you know how to analyze a cylinder, how to mark it up, how to set your computer, then that's probably not the best moment to start rebreather diving, because you will need to wrap your head around partial pressures, you will need to wrap your head around oxygen related limits, and if you've spent some time dealing with that before, that will make your rebreather journey easier. So, air diluent diver, limits 30 meters, no mandatory deco. The training tends to take, depending on the unit, between 5 and 7 days, and that training is available to you without pre-existing technical diving qualifications. Version 2 of Mod 1 would be the air diluent deco diver. And by the way, I'm using the TDI system here because I'm certifying under that system. Other agencies will have slightly different names, will have slightly different limits, but follow roughly the same idea. Air diluent deco, 40 meters with mandatory deco stops. Again, about 7 days. When people come to me aiming for that level for their first qualification, I always recommend leaving a little bit more time, because depending on your learning curve, it might just take an extra day or 2. That doesn't make you a bad diver. That simply means that to get you there to be competent and comfortable for that level of diving, we needed a little bit more time. So, in the case of the Sidewinder, you would have to be comfortable handling 3 cylinders, your side mount tanks and a deco tank. Plus, you need to have open circuit deco qualifications, something like advanced nitrox and deco procedures, for example, and some experience handling that stage. Type number 3 of Mod 1 is the Helitrox diluent deco diver. 45 meter maximum with mandatory deco stops, and with a limited amount of helium allowed in your diluent. That means that you can take advantage of breathing a less dense gas, which has several advantages that are a little bit beyond this presentation. But again, if you're unsure about gas density and the implications, comment and we can do a little video on that. So again, 7 days, although I recommend 1 or 2 more for this one. Using 3 cylinders if you're doing this on the Sidewinder and Sidemount, and the prerequisites are the same as they are for the second level for the air diluent decodiver. So all of those types, of course, are mod 1, depending on what prerequisites you start with and how you get on during the course. These are your options. All right. That pretty much brings me to the end of this presentation. Now, I'm hoping that you have some questions. There were definitely some when I was giving this presentation during the event. So hit me up. You have a comment section there. You have some contact details there. So you can definitely send me an email, drop me a WhatsApp. If you are sending me a catalog of questions, then it might just take a day or 2 before I get back to you. But don't hesitate. This is exactly what this presentation is there for. And I hope to hear from a lot of you soon.